Hello, everyone. My name is Harold Trinkunis. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. Welcome to our weekly research seminar at CSAC. We are very happy to welcome today Alison Piccioni, who, among other things, leads the multi-sensor imagery analysis team at CSAC, working on North Korea. She's also principal and founder of Armillary Services, which provides insight on commercial imaging and associated analytics, and had served as an imagery analyst in the U.S. Army, followed by additional work in the commercial sector in that area. She's been working together with Dr. Silgi Park, one of our CSAC Nuclear Security postdoctoral fellows. Dr. Park spoke last week, and Alison provided some comments on that. This week, we're going to reverse the order. Alison Piccioni will be presenting, and Dr. Park will contribute to part of the presentation as well. Just as a reminder, the talk should last 30 to 40 minutes, and that will be followed by an opportunity for Q&A. Please go ahead and enter questions you might have in the Q&A box on Zoom. This is a webinar, so I will manage the Q&A and read your questions out when the Q&A period starts. Again, thank you all for joining us, and over to you, Alison.
Great. Hi there. Thank you all, and thank you, Harold, for the introduction. So those of you who see me present at CSAC may expect a rundown of the goings-on at North Korea's nuclear facilities, punctuated by some high-resolution satellite images. To be sure, over the last 10 years, we at CSAC's imagery analysis team have been lucky to connect so much commercial imagery with so much dedicated research and complementary expertise to piece together insight pertaining to North Korea's nuclear weapons capability. Over the years, we've seen overhead images of nuclear tests, steam effluent signifying a nuclear reactor is critical, and the construction of missile facilities. But CSAC has long been asking for more from us in terms of connecting our knowledge of North Korea with our knowledge of remote sensing analytics to better understand more than just North Korea's nuclear capabilities, but North Korea's environment as a whole. CSAC has a long record of indirect and direct collaboration with North Korea. CSAC cadre have facilitated the 1994 agreed framework in an effort to replace North Korea's indigenous nuclear reactor with much larger, high-powered proliferation-resistant reactors. They traveled the country implementing the construction of these reactors as members of the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, or KEDO, prior to the abrogation of the agreement in the early 2000s. Members of CSAC visited North Korea, engaging in informal diplomatic scientific discussions, especially over the past decade. And several members have devoted years of their career facilitating aid, distribution, or modernizing the business acumen of North Korea's citizens. So while I spent half my career staring at weapons in North Korea, many others at CSAC spent their careers garnering a holistic understanding of North Korea from the ground. Which begs the question, can we use satellites to study other patterns and trends besides the strategic and military systems so strongly associated with satellite imagery in North Korea? So as Principal Geospatial Advisor to the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs' newly established Innovation Cell, I have been working to connect emerging imagery analytics with heritage, environmentally purposed space missions to identify and ultimately predict environmental and economic activity. Today, we'll be discussing emerging trends in analytics, how they are applied to better understand trade in North Korea, my current project to understand water scarcity in Iraq, and how elements of this project can be applied to expand our focus from just nuclear and military activity analysis to environmental patterns and trends. Many have asked me this question: what can satellite imagery give you that a personal perspective could not? So I believe you could never fully replace direct contact and on-the-ground level understanding of a nation and its citizens with imagery taken from hundreds of miles up in space. However, satellite imagery will always provide a critical layer of data at a vastly larger scale relating to the scope and the pace of patterns of life on the ground below. But it's only been recently when the open source community but until recently, the open source community was lacking in terms of software, method, and computer processing capability needed to trace macroeconomic patterns associated with economy, trade, and infrastructural status. Case in point, 2 years ago, we at the imagery analysis team began to ruminate over the idea of using satellite imagery to potentially study trade between North Korea and China, and how trade may fluctuate due to changes in a need for a particular good, or by season, or even by changes in diplomatic relations. We believe that by tracking long-term fluctuations in vehicles in known transshipment depots on either side of the Chinese-North Korean border, we could enhance our understanding of cross-border trade. So we discussed an approach. We would start purchasing all of the archive high-resolution imagery over each of these border crossings in North Korea, dating back as far as we could find. Over the past decade, for instance, 2,000 high-resolution satellite images have been taken over this particular area of interest. In each image, we would attempt to count each rail car or tractor trailer and truck and each shipping container. So to add it up, we would be purchasing hundreds, maybe thousands of satellite images, counting and recording approximately 20 to 500 objects in each image. The final report maybe could be a dossier with thousands of vehicles that we've counted. So those of you with experience in imagery analysis, imagine a handful, 3 or 4 researchers, counting hundreds of thousands of objects over several hundred images. We realized it just wasn't a tenable situation. There just aren't enough hours in the day to do this kind of work. And we realized we could not undertake such an analytical effort. We would soon get some help from machines and the bright scientists who programmed them. In November 2020, Solgi Park and I collaborated with the analytics company Orbital Insight to launch an experiment to count the objects that we had discussed counting a few years ago. Only this time through computer-based automated imagery analysis, which is often referred to as machine learning-driven satellite imagery analysis. Orbital Insights had years of experience tracking objects in satellite imagery to better understand broad patterns of trade and the supply chain, and had a lot of success last year actually predicting the spread of COVID-19 by monitoring vehicle congregations throughout densely populated areas on satellite imagery. So machine learning driven satellite imagery analysis has been around for quite some time, but it's only recently that the methods to count more nuanced objects are evolved enough to yield an accurate result. But more importantly, it's only recently that there's enough imagery over every area of interest to yield a true representative sample of objects and an understanding of fluctuation of said objects over time. Optical imagery, like the imagery we're looking at this slide, has historically been tricky to connect with automated analysis because optical images are a little bit like snowflakes. The angle, the light, the contrast in each image is often just different enough to skew the training data and the analytical algorithms. But machine learning-based imagery analysis has evolved to do 2 things really well. It can count objects like vehicles or rail cars, or it can measure objects like the amount of dry bulk in a shipping port or the volumes of oil stored in floating lid oil tanks. So let's shift our attention to Solgi Park, who will present to you how we're using automated imagery analysis to better understand North Korea's trade relationship with its border nations.
Thanks, Allison. So presenting from now on is a preliminary study that demonstrates the application of automated analytics to satellite images for monitoring trade activities in North Korea. Now, North Korea has a few shipping routes. There's the famous Sino-Korean Friendship Bridge, which is also known as the New Yalu River Bridge. And that's one of the main bridges between China and North Korea that's being used to transport goods between these 2 states. And there are other shipping routes between China and North Korea. That includes the Mampo-Jian Railroad crossing, as well as Tumen Namyang Road Bridge and some smaller crossings. And on the North Korea and Russian side, there's the Korea-Russia Friendship Bridge that we looked at. Now let's take a closer look at the Sino-Korean Friendship Bridge. The bridge connects the city of Dandong from China to the city of Sinuiju on the North Korean side. Now on either side of the bridge, we see these truck warehouses as well as the customs area. So these two truck warehouses were then selected as the regions of interest over which we applied automated analytics to count trucks and trailers. So here's one snapshot of our results. Next slide, please. So every truck inside these warehouses is recognized by the computer-based analytics and are highlighted in the brown circles. So each of these brown dots represents an individual trucks or trailers. Now here I'm showing one of the more extreme cases, but there are more than 100 counts of trucks in this warehouse. So what would have taken people like me half an hour or 2 hours to count takes a few seconds with the capability of automated analytics. Now, because each of these depots is so close to the border, and the amount of trucks that we see at these warehouses exceed the amount of trucks necessary for the domestic circulation, we believe that there is a high probability that the trucks observed at these warehouses indicate exchange of goods between China and North Korea. We looked at over 330 images in the periods of 5 years from 2016 to 2020, and the results indicate fluctuation of truck count since 2016. And so this graph is depicting the number of trailers and trucks as a function of time. And just to clarify, blue bar denotes number of trucks on the Sinŭiju on the North Korean side, whereas the red bar indicates number of trailers and trucks on Dandong, the China side. Throughout, we see more trucks on the Sinŭiju on the North Korean warehouse. And notably, we see a pretty significant drop of truck counts on either side of the warehouses since 2020, likely due to the border closure from COVID-19. Next slide, please. A rolling average graph can tell us a little bit more. For example, since 2018, which is when the temporal resolution of satellite images increased, we see that the truck counts from Sinŭiju side, the North Korean side, trails the truck counts of the Dandong, the China side, and that could indicate possible movements from China to North Korea. Interestingly, the greatest number of truck counts are noted on Friday and during the month of November. An assumption is made that foods such as corns or maize are being transported into North Korea during the month of November from China, whereas timber is being exported from North Korea to China during this winter month. Next slide, please. So try to capture trucks on the bridge at the Sino-Korean Friendship Bridge. However, the rather complex support structure of the Sino-Korean Friendship Bridge kind of obscures the view of the road, making it really difficult to capture the truck on the bridge. But such depiction can be done for the Namyang Tumen Bridge. This is another bridge between China and North Korea. It's fairly new. It was completed in late 2019. And here we definitely see a case where the automated analytics detected a truck on the bridge. In this case, it's facing towards North Korea. We have not observed a lot of trucks on the bridge last year in 2020, but the automated analytics did detect few trucks on either side of the parking lots at the bridge, a possible sign of trade movements. We also looked at the rail cars over Korea and Russia Friendship Bridge. And most notably, we saw a line of rail cars on September 4th of 2020. And that's 28 pretty large freight cars on the railroad on the North Korean side. And given that there's nothing else, this signifies railcar movements between North Korea and Russia, even during COVID-19 border shutdown. We are in the very early stage of exploring this project. We are not reinventing a wheel for counting trucks and trailer frequency as a way of analyzing trade, but we are demonstrating how emergence of technology can aid in satellite imagery analysis. We're showcasing the kind of potential or the feasibility that automated processing chain has in supporting such scientific or analytical studies as demonstrated using this case study of monitoring trade in North Korea. And this kind of application really helps us expand our ability to analyze North Korea to other applications besides just nuclear capabilities. Over to Allison.
Great, thank you so much, Solgi. Yeah, to put another way, we really believe that we can continue to apply these methods of object counting to a deep base of images taken over many years to better understand many patterns pertaining to trade and infrastructure in North Korea. So let's shift our focus to analyzing environmental, water, and food security trends, which has been of particular interest to CSAC as it could broaden our understanding of the environmental health and needs in North Korea. So for the last 50 years, space agencies all over the world, like the European Space Agency, NASA, and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, have been launching and operating satellites to collect Earth-centric information for the specific purpose of global space collaboration and serving the common good. These satellites have over the years amassed an archive of billions of points of data pertaining to everything from rainfall, elevational changes, ocean temperatures, vegetation health, and the quantity of moisture present in the soil. This space-based data is freely available and has been studied in research centers and universities throughout the world for over a generation. This environmentally purposed imagery or data itself is quite crude. It does not have the clarity we see in the high resolution images we've seen earlier in this presentation or that we can recognize from Google Earth. But these public mapping satellites are very good at collecting accurate but rudimentary data like we see on this image here over vast swaths of the Earth's surface, and the collection is continuous and steady. So you may not be able to see your car in this, or your house, or frankly your city, but you can broadly tell where vegetation is absent or present for any given date and every region in the world. So for comparison, in the center, we're looking at a 2-meter resolution image. This is not freely available, but it's relatively inexpensive and it's easy to obtain. Here you can see whether the land is urban or rural. You can see bridges and you can see the presence or absence of vessels and aircraft. This imagery is taken over a much smaller section of the Earth's surface and can be used to track broad changes in urban construction over time. And just as a reminder, because I get this question a lot, unlike the movies, you cannot zoom in or enhance this image to get a crystal clear detail. What you are seeing in both of these images is the limit that the satellite lens can image. But finally, as you see, the image on the right, we have exquisite resolution imagery where you can identify the objects you could not see in any of the other images. This image is taken with a huge, expensive lens from space that focuses its gaze over a relatively small swath of the Earth's surface to collect a deeply detailed image. The image is available for pay. The imagery is not taken regularly, with few exceptions, and it's not generally taken over large amounts of territory. This is incredible to look at, but it's frankly too expensive and too processing intensive to use for large-scale environmental analysis. Instead, this is what we use for security and proliferation analysis. So low res, as environmentally purposed satellites may be, the potential of this data aggregated together over time provides enormous insight into the environmental patterns and trends of any region of the world's surface. Most universities, including this one and those around the world, devote coursework or even entire departments to using this data to track everything from deforestation patterns in Borneo to algae bloom as a function of seasonal water temperatures in the Gulf of California. Most countries with access to resources and skilled scientists use this data to better understand and monitor the environment within their own borders, especially as it pertains to their own agricultural health. However, many countries, especially in the developing world, do not have the academic resources to exploit Earth observation data to its greatest extent. And although NGOs and universities can and do undertake remote sensing projects on behalf of many countries, many critical questions remain unanswered by the countries that sometimes need it most. North Korea is one of those countries. North Korea has experienced vast environmental and food insecurity over the past decades, and most notably between roughly 1994 and 1998, North Korea experienced a mass starvation event known as the Arduous March or the March of Suffering. This was a result of a series of successive floods and droughts, exacerbated by the loss of food and fuel imports from the former Soviet Union, the less than optimal crop conditions in North Korea's farmland. 25 million people were affected, and estimates still vary as to how many fatalities there were, with a general range of 3 to 5% of the entire country. As another CSAC network affiliate once described to me, nearly a generation of people in North Korea are physically stunted as a result of severe malnutrition during the Arduous March. So food security is vastly better today in the country, but even as I analyze nuclear facilities, I see signs of odd inadequacies in food distribution. Namely, every harvest season, every patch of ground space with access to sunlight is practically covered with what looks like a golden carpet from space. This is actually maize, a crop I'm told that North Koreans don't like much, but it's cheaper and easier to produce than other grains, and it is abundant throughout the country. Maize, as you see here, is dried after the fall harvest on nearly every available flat space, so it can be stored for winter. From the alleyways behind nuclear reactors to airfield taxiways, this phenomenon of the September gold blanket is a ubiquitous hallmark of this country. And as CSAC imagery analyst Nick Hansen points out to me, many times in the early spring, the same grain is taken out and dried again after mildewing in storage for months so that North Koreans can recover what assemblage they can of viably edible food. Also, plastic sheeting greenhouses are observed in every state or residential corner of this country. Our colleagues tell us North Koreans can keep some of the food they grow, they must render some to the state, and some food is grown in secret to eat or sell on the gray market. As a result, greenhouses pop up everywhere. There were several greenhouses next to the nuclear test tunnel entrances at North Korea's nuclear test site at Punggye-ri. And at one point in 2020, there was a greenhouse right outside the turbine generator room of North Korea's 5-megawatt reactor. Here, we see a greenhouse near the new support facility at North Korea's new experimental light water reactor. Any imagery analyst who's had a focus on North Korea will tell you, there is something different about how food is treated in this country compared to anywhere else on Earth. So floods have had a history of severely impacting North Korea's access to food. Last summer, I saw the worst flooding on satellite imagery that I have ever seen in the country. We know there were terrible floods in 2012 that affected food security, but I think what we saw in 2020 was at least comparable. So we've established that North Korea has food insecurity exacerbated by flooding, droughts, poor soil conditions, trade issues, and issues with the nation's domestic food distribution infrastructure. Is there a way to better understand these patterns, perhaps even recognize the precursors to food insecurity from space? In concert with my esteemed partners at the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs Innovation Cell and our geospatial partners, I'm currently working on a tracking and predictive tool to analyze water scarcity and environmental security in Iraq. Certainly, Iraq is a different region and a vastly different economic and agricultural profile. But in undertaking this project, I've begun to identify some scientists, tools, and satellites that could be better used to understand any nation's environmental strengths and vulnerabilities. Over the course of this project, our consortium of scientists and engineers at the geospatial solutions company Element 84 aggregated about 20 years worth of microtrends in rainfall, groundwater, vegetation presence, surface water extent, and soil moisture for all geographic regions within the nation of Iraq. And every month of every year since these satellites began their mission, again, with the oldest dating back 20 years. Additionally, with the support of the European Space Agency, our partners at CLS TRE Altamira processed radar satellite imagery to detect ground subsidence throughout Iraq. Ground subsidence is a very good indicator of aquifer loss. And by the end of 2020, we had curated a 500,000 point georepository of this information and had engineered a methodology to visualize this data in a straightforward way. So what you're seeing is just a tiny portion of the spreadsheet view of this, a CSV view of the database. As you can see, the row numbers at the leftmost column here already number into the hundreds of thousands. These rows are each attributed to points of the database pertaining to the region, subregion, month and year, the data type, which in this case, SMAP stands for soil moisture, and the value of said data type. And by building a search and query tool, or a dashboard as we call it, we can make the data a little bit more accessible to the viewer. Our overall goal is that anyone at the US Assistance Mission in Iraq, whether they have experience with data analytics or not, can select a particular indicator of interest, a month or year, and see an overview map depicting soil moisture availability or scarcity throughout the country. And if a user is interested in a deeper dive into a region of interest, they can click on the map to get further detail on that region's historical and rolling averages for a particular indicator. I'll stop and say, for those of us who are not geospatial analysts, I must mention that building such a database is a challenging process, but a straightforward one to a skilled team of geospatial analysts. However, we've looked and no such database has ever been curated at such a granular level in Iraq or in any country. We may not have reinvented the wheel by building this geodatabase, but we have broken ground on making this data accessible and available to those interested in understanding and potentially mitigating environmental security issues in this country. In addition to the dashboard, another way we illustrate the data was simply translating translating the geodatabase in meaningful ways. So by taking small subsets of the database into visualization tools, as simple as Microsoft PowerPoint or Tableau, we show satellite data pertaining to groundwater change in a single governorate in southern Iraq. Groundwater is a key indicator of water availability. And in this case, we see year-over-year groundwater trends between 2002 and 2020. Even accounting for seasonal swings in water availability, you can clearly see a general trend towards scarcity in the 2012 to 2018 timeframe. And indeed, this data reflects the on-the-ground reality for one of the most environmentally vulnerable governorates in Iraq. For decades, Iraq has been rife with conflict. We compared conflict incident reports with total water change between 2004 and 2017 by building a double y-axis graph. We've spoken to a number of conflict experts who caution us against ever drawing an inkling of causation between environmental scarcity and conflict. Nevertheless, in early studies, we have seen statistical instances of correlation in this country, and this type of cross-correlation could be used on other environmental factors to tell us how a change in one factor could be cotemporal or a precursor or an after effect of another environmental factor. Translating this approach, methodology, and these data sets to other countries will take effort. Iraq has an extraordinary seasonal pattern and extraordinary temperatures, and it practices different methods of cultivating different crops. However, the space-based environmental data sets that are collected over Iraq are also collected with the same frequency over North Korea. With a curated effort and research, the analytical approach could be modified and applied to this country. We believe in the immense potential of the utility here, and that data and methods like these could be used to answer some of the following questions, like in which months or years is water the scarcest? Which are they most profuse? Which geographic regions have high populations and also severe water insecurity? One that's been asked of me a lot, are there regions particularly suited to some types of crops or some types of livestock? Or does agriculture or urban development lead to water scarcity? By dint of ambiguous export controls, some space-based data sets and software tools and the software tools needed to analyze them, North Korea has very limited access to Earth observation data over its own territory. And moreover, internet access is severely limited in North Korea. All of the data, all of the software that is freely available is only so to those with access to the World Wide Web. All the while, there has been a veritable explosion of freely available resources to anyone and everyone with internet access who wants to use environmentally purposed satellite data for research in the field of geospatial analysis. The imagery is free. The geospatial software to exploit it is free. There are countless freely available scripts and programs that are shared on forums like GitHub, where people from all around the world can comment, ask questions, modify, improve, and create space-based data sets together. And geospatial analysis isn't just an academic field, believe it or not, it's kind of an enthusiast's hobby. And with such widespread access and interest, applications and resources are compounded. So I've seen Iranian university projects on geospatial analysis, entire universities in South Asia devoted to the study of it, and superb South Korean and Chinese research institutes. But I've actually, in making this presentation, I have looked at every North Korean university that has a website, and I've looked through every department. I have found no geospatial analysis departments, no classes in geospatial analysis, and no mention of Earth observation or remote sensing anywhere. I could be misinformed, but I believe that this ubiquitous, useful, and popular skill set is available everywhere in the world but North Korea. North Korea is a country that could use this information to mitigate domestic environmental disasters, but it is at best severely behind in this tradecraft, or at worst, completely uniquely devoid of it. So emerging analytical trends and the processing capacity to robustly research these trends are changing the way we can conduct open source analytics. We've put a premium on analyzing very geographically tiny amounts of very expensive, very exquisite imagery to detect the implements of nuclear proliferation in North Korea, as well as military events and activity. But we have the resources and access to experts and new technology to conduct analysis on orders of magnitudes larger than we have even a few years ago. We now have the ability to study not just a single event, but long-term patterns and trends in things like trade and infrastructure or supply chain integrity. And we can, once we understand them, we can tailor our methodologies to do other things like imagery analysis of regional construction or social infrastructure. I've always heard the size of outdoor markets throughout North Korea as a proxy for economic health. So also today, the exquisite satellites I've been talking about generally collect about 3 to 6 images per month over our areas of interest. But as more commercial satellites are launched every year, I think it's important that we prove the methods that we are going to need when instead of having 3 to 6 images a month, we have dozens of images a week. And finally, putting 500,000 data points into a searchable, comparative format with relatively intuitive tools to help visualize and understand them could make a huge difference in how well we understand environmental trends, patterns, and extremes in North Korea. In so doing, we can redirect the narrative of satellites for spycraft that I myself have helped to cultivate. Why don't we use satellite-derived information to help people access food and resources rather than spy on their nuclear capabilities? A geospatial effort might be useful to North Korea, and we could use such a study to foster collaboration or even skill building in the country. And altogether, these macro analyses of patterns of life could tell us a lot more about the overall health and welfare of a society, not just its nuclear and military capability. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Solgi. And I believe we have a time for Q&A now, a good amount of time. So again, please go ahead and enter your questions in the Q&A box of Zoom. I'll try to check chat, but I don't spot questions there as reliably. The first question, let's go to one of our CSAC fellows. It's our tradition to let our CSAC fellows ask the first questions. So let's go to Gil Baram. Thank you for your fascinating presentation regarding your North Korea project. I wonder what is the satellite resolution, and I would love to hear more about your planned future research.
Harold, could you repeat? He's asking about satellite resolution itself?
Sure. Sorry, is my voice not coming through?
No, not at all. I'm just not understanding the question.
Oh yeah, she's asking, what is the satellite resolution you're asking? And I know you're looking at multiple kinds of satellite imagery data. And also, are there future directions for your North Korea research beyond what you've done so far?
Yeah, absolutely. First question is, almost every satellite has a slightly different resolution. The ones that we use for security analysis, conventional open source security analysis, generally have a resolution of 1 meter ground sample distance. That means every single pixel that you see on that image represents 1 meter on the ground. And better, like if we call better would be 50 centimeters, which every single pixel of the satellite image is only 50 centimeters, 50 square centimeters on the ground. The highest resolution imagery today for electro-optical imagery, I want to say is about 30 centimeters. Maxar has some excellent, very exquisite satellites. And there are a lot more small sats that will provide high resolution imagery, and legacy satellites that will provide exquisite detail. And secondly, about the research in North Korea, in many ways, this is sort of a test balloon to better unpack some of the ways that we can do research in North Korea. I believe that North Korea would have a real utility in this and they'd be very interested in this. And ultimately, it would be interesting to foster a collaboration where we could work with geospatial scientists to provide, or at least to explain, environmental patterns.
Thanks, Allison. The next question is from Perry Bloom. Yes, if China and the DPRK know that satellite imagery is being analyzed to ascertain levels and state of trade, isn't it possible for either or both to deliberately provide false information, e.g. the number and type of vehicles observed, to discredit the methodology or the result of the analysis? And if I could tag on a two-finger of my own, is maybe if you could talk about how some of the different types of satellites you're using might be more or less resistant to this kind of spoofing. What I mean is, for example, some of the environmental data that you're gathering strikes me, because it covers so much greater ground, strikes me as harder to fool.
Yeah,
or maybe you can comment on both those things.
Completely agreed. Yeah, Harold, I do get the question of, like, for two ways. Does North Korea change the way it constructs things on the ground to either project more of a strategic capability or less of a strategic capability? And we had a discussion about this last week. When it comes to high resolution security analysis, North Korea absolutely does take measures to obfuscate its strategic capability from overhead. But a good imagery analyst knows how to do not just analysis, but concealment detection. And then we talk about this cat and mouse game. They will bury a pipe that I like to look at. I'll figure out another waterway that the pipe is running water through. They'll try to bury that waterway. I'll figure out another part of the river. So the game never ends. We do look at that. And I had a slide on this in this presentation, but I didn't use it. So we talked about resolution of environmental satellites. A lot of people do ask the exact same question. Can you use environmental satellites to spy on another country? In other words, could North Korea use the Landsat system to look for specific military equipment in another country? In a word, no, you can't see a vehicle on 20 or 50 meter resolution. Some is not even that low. It's like 1 degree by 1 degree cells, and you don't see an image, you just get data. Theoretically, I was having a conversation with somebody who is a geospatial analyst. It would be so difficult to use, for instance, the Landsat to unpack nuanced military trends on the ground, that if you tried to maybe interpolate like 1,000 images together, you still kind of wouldn't be able to do it. And at what point will you just say, you know, forget this, I'm going to try a human spycraft or a cyber attack? So insofar as imagery analysis can be used to spy on other countries, certainly the high resolution can be, but that is very export controlled. The low resolution that's freely available, I don't think it could ever be used to find nuanced economic activity. Or I'm sorry, military and strategic activity rather.
Thank you. The next question is from Ho-Jung Do from the Korean Institute for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Control. He says, thank you for your informative presentation, and I also enjoyed your previous presentation on nuclear activities of North Korea. Would you interpret the abundance of maize fields and greenhouses near nuclear facilities as primarily an agricultural necessity, or could the North Korean regime be using this as an example that its nuclear systems are safe?
Sure. So you put grain next to your nuclear facilities with the hope that nobody would attack it because there's agriculture?
That they wouldn't fear oh, if you can grow food next to it, it can't be that dangerous, right?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Yeah, absolutely. Possibly. I would interpret it after looking at a lot of different agricultural fields over really unmistakably dirty areas. Specifically, there's an agricultural field right next to the hydrogen fluoride processing facility at the Fuel Enrichment Center at Yongbyon Nuclear Research Center. That spills nasty chemicals on the ground, and you could see it right there. And there is an agricultural field right next to it. In my opinion, after looking at imagery over North Korea for a little over a decade, I don't think it's because they're trying to make light of the nuclear capability. I think it's because they need the access to agriculture and food.
Great. From Igor Moric, sorry if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, at Princeton, asks, what are the minimum requirements in terms of spatial resolution and especially satellite revisit time to be able to accurately track ground activity, trucks and ships within a monitored area? Is a statistical analysis possible? Also, with current commercial capabilities, is it possible to tag and track individual vehicles?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we'll start with the first one. What's the resolution you need to track? Let's go with trucks. I like 1 meter or better, or 1.5 meters or better. There are two companies that specialize in about meter or slightly over 1 meter resolution. You can count trucks. You do not need it to count ships, but it's really helpful in identifying the ship. So 1 meter resolution, and we're looking at two small sat companies, Black Sky one in particular, that's aiming to have something like twice a day revisit rate over any given area of interest. So that means you get 2 satellite images a day over the same place. I think that that would be good for tracking military vehicles. If you can't, it would not be a persistent capability, but I think if you had 2 pictures a day over the same depot or military facility, you certainly would be able to track the incoming and outcoming equipment. And then the second question was, I'm so sorry, I forgot. Could you please repeat it, Harold, for me?
Sure. Would it be possible to tag and track individual vehicles with their capabilities?
I think on 0.5 meter, like 50 centimeter or better, you could track different types of vehicles, but not different individual vehicles. There is a company or several companies that are trying to launch stratolites, which are balloons that hang out in the atmosphere. And one of them has a payload of 15 centimeter resolution. You can track people like by their faces with that resolution. I don't know if that's going to get off the ground literally, but the platform, the commercial drive is always for higher resolution. And we have seen the market try to cater for higher resolution over the last decade. Hopefully that addresses your question, Igor.
Thanks. Let me go back to one of our CSAC fellows, Melissa Carlson. She says, thank you so much for a wonderful and fascinating presentation. Could you speak to how you train the algorithms that identify and classify different objects within these images? Specifically, I would be curious to hear how you determine the parameters of these algorithms and the steps you take to reduce bias. For example, an algorithm classifying an object as a vehicle when it's actually something else.
Yeah. Okay. I've actually worked quite a little bit in this field. First of all, I think the best way to start is to delineate the geographic boundary of interest, i.e., instead of looking at an entire city and you just want to see one parking lot, delineate that. And then even if the tracking isn't perfect, a 1 meter satellite resolution could look at a single parking lot and give you a percentage of how full that parking lot is on a day, even if it can't count individual cars. And you get enough of that, you might not get perfect information or a perfect count, but you would generally, and this is what we've actually found, not a theory, you generally get a pretty decent proxy for fluctuation, if not a perfect count. And how you train the model, it's pretty straightforward for electro-optical. They actually use some of the same principles as you train the algorithms to look and search through YouTube videos. So if you're looking for YouTube videos of a cat and there's no title on the YouTube video, you have to give the algorithm something like 150,000 instances of what a cat looks like. And then you give it 200,000 instances of what a cat does not look like. And then you continuously move forward. You continuously train the algorithm. And once you've kind of done it, you pretty much have a viable algorithm that can find cat every time. And the same goes for truck, the same goes for rail car, etc. So in short, the 2 ways I think that are best to do it is you have a lot of training data, so you train the algorithm, And secondly, I think it's really helpful to delineate the area you want to look at. In fact, Solgi probably can speak to this, but when we tried to look at rail cars over an entire city, we did not yield as much success as when we kind of narrowed down to just the exact depot. Before I move on, Solgi, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think you covered it all.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Allison, Solgi. So I have two related questions. One is from Esther M. In tracking trucks parked along the China-North Korean border, is it possible to distinguish between an increase in the total number of trucks crossing the border and an increase in the wait time necessary for a truck to clear through customs, presumably because of greater, lesser enforcement of sanctions? Similarly, Dominic Ulton at the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office also asks, is this kind of work able to track the effect of changes in the sanctions regime on flows of trade between North Korea, Russia, and Russia and North Korea and China?
Solgi, as always, I have something to say, but would you prefer to start?
I think at least for the first question, we need to have a better temporal resolution of the images to see the time transition. At this point, Allison, how many images are we getting? Are we getting 2 to 3 images per week? I think in order to track the wait time, we need way more than that.
Yeah, you need persistence. I do not believe that, I always say this with every satellite image, you can't get the entire answer with satellite imagery, but it gives you a critical sort of layer of complexity to your answer. If you are able to corroborate that with other reports, I believe in Solgi's methodology of looking at vast swaths of imagery over time. You might not know what the wait time is, but you do know that there are 350 more vehicles on a Thursday generally than there are on a Monday. So, so in short, I think it's helpful. I don't think it answers the whole question, and not without more imagery can we track wait times, just to repeat what Solgi said.
And just as a side note, on the trade study that we showed, the images were taken at 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. local time. So we're only looking at what's going on at 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock in the morning. Oh, Harold, I think you're muted.
Thanks, Solgi. I think the next question may actually be from Amy Ziegert, just by recognizing what's in the question. Terrific presentation, 2 related questions. If you were advising ODNI about what should be done to work better with leading non-governmental imagery intelligence folks like you, what would you recommend? That's the Office of the Director of National Intelligence for those of you out in the rest of the world who don't follow US government acronyms. And the second question, so the first question is advising ODNI, and the second question is, what kinds of questions do you think non-governmental organizations in this field can add the most value on versus government agencies?
Okay, thanks for the questions, Amy. Solgi, if you don't mind, I'll start. Maybe you'll have something to weigh in. So if I could tell ODNI anything, I think, so there are no technical export controls on American and European environmental satellites. Again, that crude data that we're showing where you can see whether vegetation is present or absent. However, the export controls for space information are so ambiguous that sometimes you are absolutely unable to undertake any kind of research effort that might have an international audience. So I think there should be a clear distinction between very low resolution satellites that take, data with coordinates, than the exquisite resolution satellites over which there are quite a bit more export controls. And Solgi, do you have anything before I move on to what would I tell NGOs for government organizations?
No, go ahead, Allison.
All right, and Harold, please help me if I am not addressing this question correctly. But what would
I'll just say again. Just sort of what kinds of research questions do you think non-governmental organizations can address better than governmental agencies?
That's a good one. I personally, with my experience with, for instance, the American National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the European Union Satellite Center, there are very capable analysts there. There's an entire, facility in St. Louis that's just for topographic, mapping and geospatial analysis. I'm not sure that non-governmental organizations are as equipped to do just a vast array of mapping than, for instance, governments. However, the focus is often far different for governments, and the ability to disseminate the information is often difficult too. I don't see too much humanitarian assistance coming out of, for instance, NGA, not none, but I don't see a lot of it, than you would compared to, the Food and Agricultural Organization. However, the capability is greater, I think, within the UN, and especially UN and European Union governments. Harold, Amy, is that addressing your question, hopefully?
I think, yeah, I think that it's sort of what kinds of questions can the non-governmental organizations add more value on, which I think you pointed out, things like the use of this data for humanitarian assistance, where it might not be possible for NGIA to declassify that kind of data in a way that would be helpful to the UN or other organizations.
Yeah, I will repeat that I think there are a lot of UN organizations with very good geospatial capabilities and outreach to not only governments, but to sort of quasi-government space centers. And yet, I think the need for geospatial analysis is so strong, and you can do so much with it, that even like imagery analysis, giving people more imagery never tends to solve the problem. It's such a force multiplier that it requires you to do even more imagery analysis. So it's a never-ending, insatiable request for content.
Great. So I think this came up in a couple questions, which is, could you say a little bit more about exactly what kinds of imagery data is available for free, and who owns the platforms to produce that data that is made freely available?
Absolutely. I'll start. So like we mentioned, it's European and American space missions. European has the European Space Agency. They provide their Sentinel-2 data. You have to, I guess, sign up and download data, access it for free. When I wanted Sentinel data, I think I just did a Google search on Sentinel-1 data. And it's from the Copernicus program, a part of the ESA. You can download it. Also, NASA and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency, they have websites where you can download them. They're a little bit antiquated, but it's free and it's easy to do. I think in some cases you have to sign up. And in some cases there are a couple countries that are restricted from using it. I'm not sure if that's true or not anymore.
Great.
And if I may quickly add on to that, so that's free. Anything that's much higher resolution electro-optical imagery, like the stuff that we're looking at, even the 2-meter resolution from the SPOT satellite, you can buy that through the company Airbus that owns the constellation. You can buy high resolution imagery by Maxar, Airbus, ComSat, a number of companies that own the imagery. There are also image brokers. I like Apollo Mapping. Then you can go to that. They have a pan image archive that you can just look for where you want to see. You can tell the resolution that you want, and they can give you a quote for how much it's going to cost you to get the archive imagery. You can even task satellites too. So thanks, Harold. I'm sorry to talk over you.
No, please. We have time for one or two more questions. From Samantha Pitts at the Stimson Center's 38 North program. She says, thank you for your presentation, Allison. Have you seen differences in agricultural practices since the start of North Korea's border closures due to COVID and/or the flooding over the summer?
That's a great question, Samantha. And again, excellent work on the 38 North article. I have not been looking at enough imagery for me to make a qualified answer to that. Sylvie, do you want to add on to this? I simply have only been looking at nuclear facilities. They always have, the gold carpet in the fall, and they always have greenhouses. I don't see much of a fluctuation, but I don't think I've had enough of a sample to know. However, the imagery that I've seen over the floods in 2020, again, I haven't seen the aftermath, but the imagery from the floods was stunning, really stunning. I'm not sure how that played out in North Korea, but if the flood is a precursor to a famine or to food insecurity, I do believe that 2020 might have been a pretty tough year.
And maybe one final question, Allison, and I'm sort of combining a couple that are in Q&A, but also my own curiosity. You mentioned the enthusiast community around imagery analysis, and I wonder if you can speak a little bit more to that. And is this a phenomenon that looks something like what you might see as citizen science in other parts of the world? For example, citizen detection of nuclear radiation after Fukushima in Japan, and other such efforts. To what extent is the enthusiast community organized in support of some of these large projects? Because sometimes, for example, people will, scientific teams might outsource analysis to sort of volunteers or enthusiasts to be able to process large numbers of images, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Not so necessary anymore with ML these days. But anyway, the interface between the enthusiast community and maybe the more academic / scientific or NGO imagery community.
I think in terms of the geospatial analysis or like the large scale environmental analysis, there are so many universities with so many geospatial analysts, so many GIS degrees, that there isn't a shortage of analysts to work for NGOs or to work for universities or to do interesting projects at a university department. I believe, conversely, that there are so few security-related imagery analysts in the open source community, and there's a lot of interest in that. There are many enthusiasts, some, and actually you can get quite a bit of notoriety just from analyzing a satellite imagery on Google Earth and making a blog about interesting things. I believe I've actually seen many instances of people who are enthusiasts who've had blogs ended up getting hired by reputable organizations. I have seen enthusiasts also who have done work that got a lot of attention, but it wasn't sound analysis. So you have kind of a little bit of an issue, I think more so with imagery analysis, because there are too few people and analysts to refute a bad call. However, in the geospatial community, the geospatial environmental mapping community, you have the absolute abundance of professionals, and it makes the work better.
Great. And in fact, in the Q&A, somebody mentioned the Datayo platform. I may not be pronouncing that correctly, but a CSEC affiliate, Melissa Panham, runs that as a place for collaborative analysis, a platform for that. Well, thank you so much, Allison Puccioni and Silgi Park. Fascinating presentation, eliciting so many great questions and very interesting answers. Everyone, please join me in thanking Allison and Silgi. And we look forward to you joining us next week.
Thank you, Harold. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.